Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into something that could signal a pretty big shift happening right here in North America.
Yeah, potentially reshaping, everything from how we defend the continent to how goods move across the border.
And this deep dive, it's based on a specific source, this geopolitical and economic report. It's titled Toward North American Convergence, the Ottawa-Washington Draft Accord.
Right, from Polarified Geopolitics and Strategy Division, and it's dated June 12, 2025, so very current.
And the core of this report, it focuses on a significant working draft agreement, something exchanged between Canada and the United States recently.
Exactly. Think of it like an initial blueprint, like you said, not the final construction yet.
Right, so our mission today is really to take this report and pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the insights from its analysis of that draft accord.
We'll look at the key features, the potential implications, and what the report highlights as the main strategic takeaways.
Basically giving you a shortcut to understanding what this document, well, what the report thinks this document could mean.
Consider this your guide through the report's analysis, then.
Okay, first off, let's set the scene a bit.
Hmm.
What exactly is this document, according to the report? How do they describe it?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the report frames it. It's explicitly called a working draft agreement.
So, definitely not a done deal.
Not at all. It's an initial document, and the report says it was exchanged very recently, just in the second week of June 2025.
And it's short. The report mentions its brevity.
Yeah, under 5 pages, which is, kind of surprising for something potentially this significant.
That is short. Despite that, it touches on major areas.
Absolutely. Defense collaboration, Arctic infrastructure, and some specific trade reliefs.
And the report flags it as pretty important right away.
Immediately. It states it represents a kind of strategic convergence between Canada and the U.S., happening literally right before the G7 summit kicks off in Alberta.
So the timing is key here. The report sees this draft potentially redefining North America's whole geopolitical stance.
Precisely. It's seen as laying the groundwork, maybe, for a new strategic direction for the continent.
Okay, let's get into those specifics then, the areas the report covers. Starting with defense and security cooperation. What are the standout proposals here, according to the report?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. A major point highlighted is Canada formally seeking inclusion in the American-led Golden Dome initiative.
Golden Dome. Okay, what does the report describe that as? Like, in simple terms.
The report explains it as a continental missile defense shield. The idea is it integrates airspace surveillance and, importantly, early warning systems across the continent.
So Canada's looking to plug directly into that grid. That sounds significant.
It's a major integration piece.
And the report mentions a strong focus on the North, too.
Absolutely. The draft puts a big emphasis on Northern and Arctic defense modernization.
Modernization-like.
The report points specifically to focusing on dual-use infrastructure up there. Things like upgrading airfields, maybe satellite outposts that serve both civilian and military purposes.
Makes sense. And reinforcing existing structures.
Yes, it also covers reinforcing NORAD and NATO-aligned capabilities. So building on what's already there, too.
Okay, so defense isn't just missiles, it's infrastructure, alliances. What about the cyber side of things?
Yep, that's in there. The draft proposes coordinated efforts in cybersecurity and intelligence.
Any specifics mentioned?
The report notes things like joint cyber defense initiatives, looking into AI surveillance possibilities, and developing shared military AI protocols.
Okay, so it's covering a lot of ground on the security front. Missile defense, Arctic, cyber. The report then shifts gears to trade relief provisions. What specific trade issues does this draft try to tackle?
Well, this section gets into some, let's say, long-standing friction points. The report details discussions aimed squarely at unwinding the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Yes, those tariffs. They caused quite a stir when they were imposed by previous U.S. administrations.
Exactly. So the report sees this draft as an attempt to clear some of that lingering tension away.
Makes sense. What about the auto sector? That's obviously huge for Canada-U.S. trade.
Yes, the draft includes provisions focused on preserving Canadian auto sector protections.
How so?
Specifically, the report highlights efforts to ensure the Canadian EV supply chain electric vehicles maintains access to U.S. credits and subsidies. Things tied to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Right, keeping that integrated supply chain functioning smoothly, especially for EVs.
Is energy mentioned too?
It is. The report notes negotiations for smoother regulatory approvals for cross-border energy pipelines.
What kind of energy?
It covers a range. Hydroelectric is mentioned. LNG, liquefied natural gas, and also hydrogen exports. So existing and future energy sources.
Okay, so addressing established trade and looking ahead. Beyond those specific trade issues, the report talks about regulatory alignment and industrial strategy. How does the draft approach that, according to the analysis?
This part seems really aimed at creating, let's call it symmetry in how both countries approach key industries, especially grain ones.
Symmetry how? The report points to aligning Canada's clean energy tax incentives more closely with the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, trying to make their green strategies work together, not against each other.
Right. So one country's incentives don't accidentally undercut the other's investments. I can see that. What else falls under this industrial strategy umbrella in the draft?
There's significant proposed bilateral cooperation on rare earths and semiconductors. Critical stuff.
Covering what aspects?
According to the report, it covers the whole chain: mining, refining those critical minerals, and even semiconductor packaging.
And the goal there.
The shared goal, as the report puts it, is building up North American supply chains that are independent of China.
That ties right back to the geopolitical context the report mentioned earlier, doesn't it? Using economic policy for strategic positioning.
Exactly. Now, the report also gives us a timeline for how this might unfold. What should you be watching for?
Okay, yeah, milestones are helpful. What does the report anticipate?
Well, it lays out a few key dates or periods. First, the draft was exchanged in June 2025, week 2. That's already happened, obviously.
Right, which brings us right up to now. So what's next on the report's projected timeline?
The very next item is the G7 Alberta Summit. That's scheduled for June 15th, 16th, 2025.
So like days away.
Exactly. And the report identifies this summit as a key target for announcements or updates related to this draft accord.
Okay, so if you're following this, that summit is the immediate thing to watch for any official signals or progress. What about further out? Does the report look beyond the G7?
It does. It anticipates a CUSMA review phase happening sometime between late 2025 and mid-2026.
CUSMA making the main trade deal, Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement.
Right. And following that review phase, an implementation phase for this specific accord is apparently in the planning stages for the first half of 2026.
Okay, so the G7 is the immediate focus, but the report suggests this is part of a process unfolding over the next year or so, potentially linking into that bigger CUSMA review down the line.
That seems to be the picture the report paints.
Let's zoom out again then. What does the report say about the bigger geopolitical implications if this draft agreement actually moves forward and gets finalized?
What's particularly insightful, I think, is how the report frames the impact on the whole North American security architecture.
How so?
It argues that including Canada in Golden Dome isn't just about, connecting defense systems. It strategically positions Canada within a continental missile defense framework that the report states is designed to counter threats. Russia, China, maybe rogue actors are mentioned. And it also strengthens Canada's existing role within NATO. That's especially relevant, the report notes, with new Arctic members like Finland and Sweden joining the alliance.
So it's not just about Canada protecting itself, but how that integration shores up continental and even transatlantic security. What about the economic side, geopolitically speaking?
The report sees this potentially having a big impact on economic integration. The trade relief measures, for instance, are viewed as a strategic move against the kind of protectionism that strained relations in the past. And that regulatory alignment on green energy, especially getting in sync with the IRA, could help both countries de-risk major investments in climate tech, making it safer maybe to pour billions into those sectors.
De-risking investment, yeah, that sounds like a key phrase the report is emphasizing there. And the Arctic, how does that fit into the geopolitical picture here?
The report suggests this draft could really act as a catalyst to formalize a shared Arctic strategy between Ottawa and Washington.
Which could influence what?
Crucial stuff like continental shelf claims, protocols for resource development up there, maybe even joint policies for navigating the Northwest Passage, big picture Arctic governance.
Right, a coordinated approach to a region that's just growing in strategic and economic importance. Now, the report also gets specific about potential economic effects if this deal were finalized. What kind of numbers or projections does it mention?
Yeah, it offers some projections based only on the report's own analysis, of course, across several sectors. For steel and aluminum, it estimates a potential jump of 15–20% in export growth for Canada if those tariffs are unwound.
That's a pretty noticeable bump for those industries.
Definitely. For auto manufacturing, it projects that the draft's provisions would likely maintain, or maybe even slightly improve, Canada's access to the U.S. market, particularly thinking about those EV credits.
Okay.
Energy. For energy exports like hydro and LNG, the report sees potential for increased infrastructure investment starting maybe Q4 2025 onward, likely tied to those smoother regulatory approvals we talked about.
Investment following clearer rules, essentially.
Exactly. And for rare earths and semiconductors, the report projects increased bilateral R&D, more efforts to scale up refining and packaging capacity here in North America.
Building that independent supply chain.
Right. And finally, in defense, it anticipates, potential increases in procurement contracts and local manufacturing orders linked to all that modernization effort, especially in the North.
So according to this report's analysis, the draft could translate into some tangible economic benefits across several key Canadian sectors if it goes ahead. Let's wrap this up maybe with the strategic takeaways that the report itself really emphasizes. What are the key messages?
Yeah, the report is very clear on a few main points it wants readers to take away. First, this draft represents phase one.
Phase one.
Meaning the immediate focus is on this targeted trade relief and defense coordination now. A bigger, more comprehensive overhaul of CUSMA itself is anticipated later, maybe late 2025 to mid-2026.
Okay, so this is seen as the first step, potentially towards something bigger. What else does the report highlight?
It stresses that Canada, through this, is really asserting its Arctic relevance, both by seeking that missile defense inclusion and by pledging infrastructure upgrades up north.
And the U.S. angle?
The U.S., for its part, is seen as actively seeking a more unified continental front. This is framed as a response to global supply chain battles and that whole tech decoupling dynamic with China.
So positioning it as a strategic move by both countries reacting to the current global environment.
Yes. And it really hammers home that the Alberta G7 summit is the immediate, very tangible event to watch. For any visible progress, any signs this draft is actually moving forward.
Got it. Watch the G7. And finally, the report placed particular emphasis on that Golden Dome missile defense piece, right?
It did. It calls Golden Dome inclusion more than just symbolic. The report actually describes it as a move that could fundamentally reposition Canada's entire military posture for the next, 30 years.
Wow. Okay. That's a significant claim, 30 years. And the report also briefly mentions it includes recommendations for stakeholders. Just briefly, what was that about?
Yeah, it throws in some suggested actions for different groups, like telling Canadian businesses to maybe prepare for tariff rollbacks, defense contractors to monitor for new RFPs, energy companies, even researchers and media.
So it has a practical angle, too.
Exactly. It shows the report is trying to outline how different players might need to react or prepare if this accord actually progresses.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into this Polarify report analyzing the Canada-U.S. draft accord. It's just a brief working draft, yes, but one the report suggests is highly significant, potentially impacting defense, trade, the Arctic.
Yeah, it highlights that potential Canadian inclusion in a continental missile defense shield, efforts to unwind tariffs, preserving that key auto sector access, smoothing energy approvals, aligning green energy incentives with the U.S.
And boosting cooperation on critical minerals and semiconductors.
Right, all framed by the report, as you said, as strengthening North American supply chains and the continent's overall strategic position.
So while this is still just a draft, remember the areas it touches on, from continental security and trade jobs to, infrastructure investment and the critical supply chains you rely on every day, could see significant impact down the line if this moves forward.
Definitely keep a close watch on that G7 summit in Alberta this week for any news.
And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider, drawn from how this report frames things. It talks about redefining North America's posture, seeking a unified front.
So ask yourself, what could a truly converged economic and security approach actually mean for this continent's role, its resilience on the global stage in the decades ahead, especially given all the global dynamics the report points to?
It's certainly something to keep thinking about as this story develops. Keep watching for those updates.